storing tissue. It is the supporting and storing tissue. And what about colongamma? It provides mechanical support and elasticity to the plants. It provides mechanical support and elasticity to the plants. And the main supporting tissue is the sclerenchyma. Main supporting tissue is the sclerenchyma. So this is the thing about simple permanent tissue. What about complex permanent tissue? Complex permanent tissue means complex permanent tissue is composed of the tissue composed of more than one type of cells is called a complex permanent tissue. Complex permanent tissue consists of two things, that is xylem and phloem. What is xylem doing? Xylem conducts water and minerals in vascular plants. Which conducts water and minerals in vascular plants? Xylem. So xylem, the duty of the xylem is to conduct water and minerals in vascular plant. The duty of the xylem is to conduct water and minerals to the minerals in vascular plants. What about phloem? The food conducting tissue of the vascular plant is called phloem. The food conducting tissue of the vascular plant is called phloem. So this is a small flow chart regarding the permanent tissue. Permanent tissue is classified into two: simple permanent tissue and complex permanent tissue. Tissue composed of only one type of cell is called a simple permanent tissue. Tissue composed of more than one type of cells is called a complex permanent tissue. Simple permanent tissue is again classified into three: parenchyma, colongamma and sclerenchyma. What is parenchyma? It is simply the supporting and storing tissue. What about colongamma? It provides the mechanical support and elasticity to the plants. So colongamma provides mechanical support and elasticity to the plants. And what about sclerenchyma? It is the main supporting tissue in the case of plants. What about complex permanent tissue? Consists of two or classified into two: xylem and phloem. The duty of the xylem is to conduct water and minerals, and the food conducting tissue of the vascular plant is called phloem. So this is the small flow chart regarding permanent tissue. So moving to the animal tissue, as we already studied about plant tissue, right now we are in animal tissue. So animal tissue is divided into four: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue and nervous tissue. As all the subdivisions also have another subdivision that we will discuss later. Right now the animal tissue, the animal tissue is mainly classified into four: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue and nervous tissue. What is meant by epithelial tissue? Or otherwise we can say that what is the duty of the epithelial tissue here? It is covering or protective tissue which act as a barrier between the various system of the body. So epithelial tissue is the covering or protective tissue which act as a barrier between the various system of the body. Which body? Animal body. So here it is act as a covering or protective tissue. Which tissue? Epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is a covering or protective tissue which act as a barrier between various system of the body. Which act as a barrier between various system of the body. So it is a covering or protective tissue. Which tissue? Epithelial tissue is a covering or protective tissue in the case of an animal tissue which act as a barrier between various systems of the body. So what about connective tissue? The binding and supporting tissue is called the connective tissue. So in the animal tissue there is connective tissue. The binding and supporting tissue is called connective tissue. Connective tissue consists of a lot of subdivision that we want to study later. So it is a binding and supporting tissue. Then what about muscular tissue? It helps us in the movement of the organs. So muscular tissue helps us in the movement of the organs. And what about nervous tissue? Help to transmit signals to respond for the stimulus received by the sense organs. So help us to transmit the signals to respond for the stimulus received by the sense organs. So the stimulus is received by the sense organs and it help us to, which tissue? Nervous tissue help us to transmit signals. Nervous tissue help us to transmit signals, and that signals which is to respond for the stimulus received by the sense organs. So that's all about the nervous tissue. So what all the tissues are here? Animal tissue is classified mainly into four: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue and nervous tissue. So the nervous tissue, simply means that help us to respond with the signals received by the sense organs. What about epithelial tissue? It is the protective and covering tissue. Then what about the connective tissue? Binding and supporting tissue. What about the muscular tissue? It helps us in the movement of the organs. These all are the four mainly classified tissues in the case of animal tissue: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. Now moving to the epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is again classified into five: squamous epithelial tissue, cuboidal, columnar, ciliated, and stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So it is classified into five: squamous epithelial tissue, cuboidal epithelial tissue, columnar epithelial tissue, ciliated epithelial tissue, and finally stratified squamous epithelial tissue. What about squamous epithelial tissue? It is a single thin layer of flattened cells with irregular boundaries. Single thin layer of flattened cells with the irregular boundaries. The boundaries are irregular with the flattened cells and single thin layer. So, on account to the squamous epithelial tissue, the major thing coming into the mind such that it is a single thin layer tissue, flattened cells with the irregular boundaries. Where we can found squamous epithelial tissue, the walls of blood vessels having squamous epithelial tissue. Next one is cuboidal epithelial tissue. Cuboidal epithelial tissue, the appearance is cube-like structure. The appearance is cube-like structure. It is mainly found in glandular tissue and kidney. So lining of kidney or glandular tissue. Which one? Cuboidal epithelial tissue. Next one is columnar epithelial tissue. That is column-like appearance. More width than cuboidal. Column-like appearances. And lining of stomach and intestine having columnar epithelial tissue. Then lining of respiratory tract of a human, not lining of human respiratory tract. Consists of that means lining of human respiratory tract having ciliated epithelial tissue. Next one is stratified squamous. The main duty of the stratified squamous epithelial tissue is that it is act as a protective layer. Which one? Stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Where we can found the stratified squamous epithelial tissue? It's the outer layer of the skin. So as in the example, it is mentioned that outer layer of the skin which has a protective duty. That the duty of the stratified squamous epithelial tissue is that the protective duty. That means it acts as a protective shield or a protective layer. So the outer layer of the skin will act as have a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Right now, the animal tissue, as we know that it is divided into four. Again, the epithelial tissue from that category is divided into five: squamous epithelial tissue, cuboidal epithelial tissue, columnar, ciliated, and stratified. Which one act as a protective layer? Stratified squamous epithelial tissue will act as a protective layer, and it will seen in the outer layer of the skin. So lining of the human respiratory tract as a ciliated epithelial tissue. Lining of stomach and intestine as a columnar epithelial tissue. Glandular tissue and kidney lining having cuboidal epithelial tissue, and the walls of blood vessels having squamous epithelial tissue. So these are the five major classification of epithelial tissues. So moving to connective tissue. Previous section we discussed with epithelial tissue. Here we